Hello, friends, and welcome to Theology Project Author Interviews. I'm Matt O'Reilly, here with Dr. Curt Thompson, who is the author of two books, Anatomy of the Soul, subtitled Surprising Connections Between Neuroscience and Spiritual Practices That Can Transform Your Life and Relationships. He is also author of another book called The Soul of Shame, Retelling the Stories We Believe About Ourselves. Curt, welcome to Theology Project. Glad to have you with us.
Matt, thank you so much. It's a joy to be with you this morning.
So I'll also say Curt is a board-certified psychiatrist. He's in private practice. He speaks at conferences and churches regularly, and you can connect with him at beingknown.com. I'll drop a link to that in the show notes below. So be sure to check that out. And while you're checking out the video description, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, share it on your social media, help us spread the word about what we're doing here at Theology Project. And before we jump into the interview, I've got a lot of questions for you, Curt. I want to tell our viewers about a conference that you're doing with us at Hope United Methodist Church in the Montgomery area of Alabama on February 5th and 6th. So it's a Friday night and a Saturday morning. The conference is called The Science of Spiritual Formation. It's COVID-19, so limited in-person attendance on this one. We've got space for 50 folks. You can register for that online. But we're also, because we want to be able to reach a broader audience in these days of smaller gatherings, we're going to broadcast the conference online. So this will be exciting for us. You can register for the Science of Spiritual Formation at hopehuleumc.org/science conference. Again, the link is below. We've got some early bird registration discounts running through January 6th. So sign up quickly. The conference is made possible in part through a grant from the Henry Center for Theological Understanding and the John Templeton Foundation. So we're grateful to our partners. We're grateful to Curt. I'm excited to have you come to the Montgomery area, Curt.
Matt, I've never been there and have long wanted to be and able to be there. And so I'm excited to be able to join you.
So just a quick preview for our viewers. We're looking at our three sessions focused on the science of hope, the science of brokenness, and the science of wholeness. Curt, you want to give us like a 2-minute preview of what that might look like?
So it is, I think, evident that we live in a broken world, and part of that brokenness is that it makes it easy for us to forget that the world was first made hopefully.
So good.
And we're going to first begin to explore the notion of what does it mean from a biblical perspective, from a Christian perspective of what it means to be human, and therefore from a neuroscience perspective, from an embodiment perspective in this field that I work in, interpersonal neurobiology. How does the neuroscience and the work on the structure of attachment, how does that reflect the biblical narrative of hope? First of all, what does it mean for us that God made us hopefully? He has great vision for us as a world, as human beings, in our personal lives. But we also recognize that the world is not what we want it to be. It doesn't take much to look around and see things are pretty broken in a lot of different ways. And in this last year, we've got more evidence than we can shake a stick at that would confirm that things are not as they should be. Things are not the way we want them to be. And so we're also going to explore, what does that brokenness look like beyond what seems obvious, and how does that show up in the neuroscience of the mind? What does brokenness look like in terms of our mind's function and activity? And in particular, what's the role that shame plays in that functional brokenness? When we see that, like, we aren't left in that broken place, we aren't left in that place of shame, that God comes in Jesus, the culmination of God's coming to us comes in Jesus, and he doesn't just come to take us to some place called heaven when we die, right? This is God's serious reclamation project in which we are being renewed even now in light of and in the wake of the resurrection and Jesus' ascension. We are being renewed, and that's not just a metaphor, that there is real neurobiological and relational implications to what it means for us to live into a life of holiness, to live into a life of wholeness. And so coming to better understand what that actually looks like in the function of the brain, in the function of the mind, and in the function of relationships from a neuroscience standpoint, I think can be helpful for us, because anytime we have a better sense of what the material world is doing when God is at work, gives us a better handle on how we can then join him in the work that he's calling us to join him in doing.
Very good. I'm very excited about this conference. You don't have to be in the Montgomery area to attend. We're going to broadcast it. If you attend virtually, you will have the chance to ask questions, to be involved in Q&A. hopehullumc.org/science conference, link below. Be sure to join us. It's going to be a really exciting, top-notch conference. Curt, before we talk about the book, tell us a little bit about how you got interested in these kinds of questions about souls and bodies and science and spirituality.
Well, Matt, I grew up, as we were talking earlier, I grew up in an evangelical Quaker community and was immersed in relationships and practice of faith, came to faith at an early age, but also not long after that, found myself wrestling with a lot of the things of faith. And so I, even as a young guy, was kind of predisposed to asking questions of like, why am I feeling and thinking the way I'm feeling and thinking? And fast forward a number of years, getting to medical school, and as I've told people, I didn't feel like I discovered psychiatry. I felt like it found me, and this place where the things that I was interested in, necessarily, what does it mean for us to be human, and the intersection of that, and the science that we're learning about it, and from the medical perspective, all seemed to come together. And then about 8 years ago or so, I became acquainted with the work of Dan Siegel and interpersonal neurobiology, and this particular field really put even more flesh on the bones from a material standpoint. What does it mean for us to think about how the mind actually works? You'd think that one would have gotten that training in, a residency training program for psychiatry. But over the last 15 to 16 years I've found myself immersed in this mysterious and beautiful exploration of the mechanics of what we read about in the story of the Bible. And anytime that we can bring together the how does this work question to the question of what the purpose and why are we even doing this, those kinds of questions have all long intrigued me. And so the work that we study in interpersonal neurobiology has, as I've told people, that work is work that is exploring the nature of the material world, the world that God made.
Yep.
And so in this way, God is using his material world to speak fresh language into the very nature of the gospel that we read about in Scripture.
So good. So all of that is very helpful to me. It's helpful to kind of have a sense of your trajectory, which leads me to another question. So a lot of people, and I think I kind of grew up in an evangelical world that reflected this, a lot of people see spiritual formation and bodily life as two very different things. I remember hearing, people say things like your body is kind of a tent for your soul or your spirit, or I remember hearing a preacher say one time, the body's like glorified Tupperware, and when you go to heaven, you kind of shed that. And
wow,
I find that now deeply unsettling, but it's not clear to me that we've really overcome that sort of thing broadly in evangelicalism. We're making some progress. So what's the problem? Like, why is it a problem to see spiritual formation as generally unrelated to our bodily life?
Well, Matt, one thing I remind people of is that even when we talk about science, to get to your question, when we talk about science, we have to remember that science itself, at least in the Western tradition, grew up at a time when the philosophy of the Western tradition was moving in an increasingly rationalistic, individualistic, empirical direction that continued from the time of Descartes, but even before that, it continued in this sense of like my body and my mind are these separate things.
Right.
And this flies in the face of what we read about in the second chapter of Genesis, where we read that "And the Lord God formed the man from the dust of the earth, and he breathed the breath of life into man's nostrils, and man became a living being." And that text tells us that we are embodied and breathed creatures. We are both of these things. And if you take either our dirt or our breath away from us, we stop being fully human.
Yep.
That we are extensions of the very beauty of the earth out of which we have been formed. And God is passionately in love with all of this. Not to mention the fact that, like, a spiritual way of thinking about the world in which the most important thing for me is just this kind of abstract felt sense of my inner self, theologically becomes rather difficult, because at the end of the day, my body wants to do all kinds of things that I can't get it to do, or it wants to not do things that it should be doing. And so it doesn't really make a lot of practical sense to think that my body isn't part of my spiritual formation. When we read the New Testament, when we read the Old Testament, when we read the entire text, we see that bodies are hugely important as part of what God intends for us to become. Because, like, I love people with my hands, with my voice, with my eye contact. That's how we know we're loved. In the work that we do in psychiatry, we tell people, look, until I sense something in my chest, it is not yet ultimately real for me. And so the danger in separating these things is that, first of all, we miss out on the possibility of experiencing God's utter delight with who we are in our physicality. And instead, I can end up just kind of like disposing it and then end up mistreating it in all kinds of ways because I don't see it as being all that important. But we also then miss out on discovering the power that exists in my embodied presence when I walk into the room. When Jesus says, "You're the light of the world." That's not abstraction. That's not just metaphor. This is, when Matt walks into the room, like your very embodied presence, when you walk into the room, people feel the difference. Because, like, a person who looks like you, who's got your voice tonality to it, is in the room, and now the room is a better place to be because of your very body being in the room. And so the other notion then is that if my body is this important, helping to pay attention to how it works in the world, which is what neuroscience is helping us to do, helping pay attention to this also gives us new insight into what Paul talks about in the New Testament when it comes to sanctification, when it comes to us becoming, like, literally putting on Christ, when it comes to our becoming renewed in our mind. It doesn't just have to be an abstract thing. It can be something that I literally do with my body that enables me to partner with God as he is bringing me to glory, as it were.
I can't help, when you describe the significance of bodies in rooms, I can't help but think about the world we live in right now. Where families are foregoing Thanksgiving, Christmas gatherings. Churches have been some churches still have not resumed meetings because of our pandemic situation. Like, I can't help but think, and I've said this to some of my colleagues, that we are going to be dealing with long-term consequences that we've not even begun to understand. And I wonder if you can comment on that from your perspective as a practitioner.
Right.
What are we looking at?
Right. Well, I think there are a couple things to say about that. One is the reality is a realistic perspective is that we were not made for this. We were made to be in the room with each other. And at the same time, we will also say that there are lots of things for which we have not been made. We were not made for cancer. We were, like the Jews, were not made for their exile to Babylon. There are lots of things for which we have not been made, for which we would say, gosh, what are going to be the consequences of this? This is just nasty. And like things could be bad. To which we would say, things will be hard, and to which we would say, God does not ever run out of options. And so in this time and space, for instance, where it's important for us to grieve the things that we've lost, and for us to continue to grieve them and to lament them. And in our practice of lament, even if we're doing it over Zoom calls, as hard as that can be over a long haul, it calls upon us at the same time to say, when I am on my Zoom call, I am going to make the most of this. I am not going to just simply have the conversation with Matt. I'm going to make sure that I say to Matt, I can't tell you how good it is to see your face and to hear your voice. This is something that we might not say if we gathered together to have this conversation together, for instance, in your office. I'd walk in, I'd say, hey, it's great to be here. But I wouldn't have to say that much more than that, because the fact that I'm actually in your office would indicate to your body that my body's glad to be there. But because it can't be, it requires extra work of intentionality, of naming preemptively, intentionally, that our purpose in being together is to love one another, even if we're doing this through a screen. And so in some respects, one of the things that this whole time period gives us as an opportunity is to awaken to a lot of the things that we actually could be doing with people in person that we've never done before. Like, we don't say to people, can I just stop you and say thank you for inviting me to be on this call? I just want to stop. I just want you to take that in for 10 or 15 seconds. Like, we would never do that if we were in person. We'd just say, hey, thanks for having me over, and I would leave.
Yep.
This also, though, provides opportunity for us, I would say, to practice one of the things that we have always had a hard time, I mean, as humans, and that is the practice of being receptive to love. We are not very good at, we are not very practiced at that. So, like, no wonder I can't love my neighbors, let alone my enemies, because I'm not very practiced at being receptive to love. And in this time, where we're less embodied with each other, that practice becomes even more difficult because we're not together. But our not being together exposes the degree to which our receptivity to love has been so difficult long before COVID. And so I think that one of the things in this conference that we're going to discover is that, especially when we talk about the wholeness part of this, is going to be, what does it mean for us to begin to practice loving one another, but also what does it mean for us to practice being receptive to love in brand new ways?
Yeah, that's helpful. That's really helpful. I want to keep thinking through some of those issues. So we're talking a lot about the brain, whether it's the way we react to each other in embodied situations. Help us, it might be helpful as a prep for the rest of our conversation. Just give us a quick layperson's introduction to how our brains work. When we talk about neural firings, what are we talking about?
Right. So our brain has about 100 billion brain cells. We call those neurons. Those neurons are in different parts of the brain, and they have different functional capacities. Different neurons don't look the same. They don't act the same in different parts of the brain. And it's easy for us to imagine that my mind, for instance, is just confined to and or reducible to the brain cells that are in my head or maybe my central nervous system, that's what my brain is, that's what my mind is, it's reducible to that. But we come to find that my mind is far more than just my brain. You know, a quick example of this would be that when a newborn comes into the world, as we say, when she's born, she comes into the world looking for someone looking for her. And she does this because about 15 to 20% of her neurons, of her brain cells that are in her brain, are loaded and ready to go to do what they're supposed to do to help her little newborn self be in the world. But the other 80 to 85% of those neurons, in order for them to mature and to become able to fire in the patterns that they need to fire for her to flourish, requires her to have interpersonal interactions with other people. Her interactions with other people's relational presence helps turn those neurons on. And so we see that the mind is not reducible to the brain. that the brain does hold for us. And therefore there's no interaction. There's nothing that we sense or image or feel or think that does not involve the brain. And so my body is always involved in some way, shape, or form. But it is also the case that my body is always acting in a context that is relational by its very nature. Even if I'm alone in my room, I am often thinking relationally because I'm thinking about people, I'm thinking about relationships, and those relationships have already had impact on how my brain is forming. And to our listeners, I want to say this goes right back to this notion that the Lord God formed the man out of the dust of the earth and breathed the breath of life into man's nostrils. This sense that I'm relational and I am embodied. I am this complex, mysterious, combined thing that I have to tend to in all of these different ways, such that when I talk about spiritual formation, I'm talking about the formation of my brain, the formation of relationships, and how both of those things have deep interactions on one another over the course of my lifetime.
So in Anatomy of the Soul, you make the comment that we don't have any experiences for which there's not a corresponding neural event, like a firing neural connection. Talk about that. I mean, and we get that in terms of, I think that's an aspect of our physicality, but talk about that in relation to our spirituality. You know, I mean, when I pray, something's happening in my brain. Mm-hmm. When I worship with the church on Sunday morning, something's happening in my brain. Help us understand those dynamics. Like, what's the significance of that?
So as I just hinted at, there's really nothing that I experience that does not involve the activity of my brain. My brain is involved in everything that I sense, image, feel, think, or do. My experience of God, then, is necessarily going to be one that activates and is reflected in particular firing patterns in my brain. Now, to be clear, and this question has been raised and others have wondered about this, there is no part of my brain that is like the God part of my brain, that if I could just like pinpoint where that is, that somehow then everything and work on that part, then everything about me and God would be fine. But neither is there a particular part in your brain that is dedicated to your mother or to your dad or your brothers or sisters or the Ohio State Buckeyes. Thanks be to God, right? So I'm from Ohio. All right, so I'm speaking to an Alabama audience too. I realize that. So there is this sense in which we like to think, though, that my body, when I pray, that somehow that's not having anything to do with my brain. It has everything to do with my brain. And the very notion that I can image who God is only possible because the right parietal lobe of my brain is working. If we were to cut that out, you wouldn't have an embodied way to have an image of God, but neither would you have an image of your wife or your husband. And so we see that in this way, spiritual formation is always something that is actively engaging my body as a fundamental element of it. I don't ever talk about spiritual formation with it ever being apart, separate from, what am I doing with my body? Hence, when St. Paul says, therefore, by the mercies of God, I beseech you, present your bodies as living sacrifice. He doesn't say present your spirits, present your abstract selves, present your bodies, because in presenting your body, your mind is coming along for the ride.
So, and that, and it's striking to me to think then, and I want to kind of move in terms of the practice. We're talking about practices, whether it's worship, prayer, different kinds of things, and practices that are done over a longer period of time carry long-term implications for the way that our brains are formed. Mm-hmm. So I remember when I first read about a study on contemplative prayer, I think it was, and so people who engage in serious 20, 30 minutes or more of prayer on a daily basis for 8 weeks or more, like it actually changes the structure of the brain.
That's right.
talk to us a little bit about that. I think, there's an axiom, neurons that fire together, wire together. Is that how it goes?
Hebb's axiom, right.
So we've talked a little bit about, the principle of this. How about the principle over time? Like, what are we talking about in terms of long-term formation?
One of the beautiful things that we're discovering with interpersonal neurobiology is this, some of the studies that have enabled us to see how particular ways in which we direct our attention, as we like to say, my capacity to focus my attention is like the ignition key in a car. It turns everything on. What I pay attention to is what I become. My attention has the capacity of directing neural firing patterns in my brain. So what this means is that if I meditate on, if I practice centering prayer, I'm going to be strengthening, because like anything, if I practice playing a certain piano piece over and over and over and over again, I become so proficient at it that I can play it from memory. I play it without looking at music. The music becomes me. It's embedded in my body. I feel this. And if we watch the pianist, we get the sense that the music owns the pianist and not the other way around. If we are practicing meditation on the scriptures, for instance, it literally has the capacity, especially in the part of the brain called the hippocampus, the part that is responsible for short-term memory, among other things. The hippocampus, the very thickness of the cell structures in the hippocampus begins to grow as we practice these kinds of activities. And what does this mean in practical sense? It means that in the same way that if I'm doing curls in the weight room, we're going to see that the bicep grows. And we don't want the bicep to grow just so that we can show somebody a bigger bicep. The bigger bicep indicates that I now have the capacity to do something different with the tennis racket. I can do something different on the basketball court or other kind of physical activity. That my brain is making changes in this way is a practical signpost that I now have the capacity to live differently in the world as a function of my having practiced contemplative prayer. And it's not just because I'm doing this abstract thing and I hope that when I get home tonight and I'm in the kitchen and something happens and I'm tempted to lose my patience, that God will magically step in. No, we're saying that if I'm actually doing these kinds of things that create this kind of a pattern in the brain, when I get home tonight and I'm tempted to be impatient, I am much less likely to do that because my brain practices, like my practice of the piano, like my practice of lots of things, is going to help me move in a different direction. And we would say this is what the Holy Spirit is doing in all of us if we are open to paying attention that that's what its hope and mission is.
So the idea is not just sort of manipulating my physiology for behavior modification. It's really about like not behavior modification, but personal transformation.
Right. Well, and I think, again, we use language in interesting ways. So when we say behavior modification, we use that phrase, behavior modification, as if that's a separate thing from what's going on in the rest of my mind. And so we would want to say, well, there's no behavior that's being modified apart from what I'm sensing or imaging or feeling or thinking at the same time. If I'm modifying behavior, I'm modifying lots of other things at the same time in order to pull that off. And so, again, there's this tendency for us to use language like that exemplifies this kind of modernist way of thinking that we're separate people. And so we would say that, it doesn't make it a bad way to use language, but when we use that language, we would say, well, I'm going to do something with my body that is also, because my body is inseparable from my spirit, from my soul, wherever those lines happen to be, that I'm actually doing work with a part of my humanity that is moving me, that is helping me what I would say, helping me practice for heaven. Everything that we're doing in the world of interpersonal neurobiology, we talk about this notion of integration, this notion of different functions and forms of the mind being brought together, like an orchestra being brought together in this whole place where you've got strings and woodwinds and brass and so forth. And integration is a state in which we flourish, where we are both differentiated, the strings and the brass, they know what they're doing, but we're also linked. They're brought together to pay attention to one another. Not unlike Paul's writings in 1 Corinthians 12 in the body of Christ, that we are this group that's being brought together in an integrated way. And when I talk about anything that I'm doing with my body, we're saying like, yeah, there is a certain part of my mind's activity that has to do with my body, that this is the percussion part of the orchestra that's going to practice doing something. And in so doing, it's creating the possibility for wonderful other things to be taking place as far as the entire symphony is concerned. But because we are a people who are both embodied and breathed, we're dirt and we're breath, anything that we're doing that brings greater integration to the mind, we would say is bringing greater wholeness to the mind, necessarily has to be done in the context of community, because I'm not able to do this by myself. I actually need the presence of other brains in the room to pull this off. We see that this integration, this bringing together of the body of Jesus, is something that takes place not just in me as an individual, but requires the bringing together of me and those other parts of the body at the same time. And the neuroscience that we see would reflect the beauty of all of this.
Yeah. I think what I'm getting at, and I guess I'm trying to do is think, we've got sort of a psychological, biological, neuroscience view, and then kind of from a theological side. So pastorally, like when we talk spiritual formation or we talk holiness, a lot of people sort of bring this kind of like holiness is like there's a list of requirements and I need to do them or something like that. So that I have to behave in a certain way if I'm going to be a holy person. And that's not right. Holiness obviously carries behavioral implications.
Sure.
But pastorally, I want to come back and as a theologian, I want to come back and say, but if that's all we think about, then we've missed it largely, right? That there is a relationship to be cultivated with God in Christ through the Spirit in the context of the church that makes us into a certain kind of person by knowing Him and being known by Him, all line language, right? And then becoming that kind of person results in behavior, life, character, personality that honors God and commends the gospel. I mean, I guess the reason I articulate it that way is I think we're talking about the same kind of things from different disciplinary perspectives.
Right. Well, Matt, in The Soul of Shame, I write about how we have all this interpersonal neurobiological like mechanics that we talk about, like how does the mind work and how does it work relationally and so forth. But I emphasize that we only ever understand any of this in the context of a story. Humans are storytellers. And by the time we're about 2 years old, we start to do that, and we keep doing it until we're dead. And we have to tell stories in order for us to survive, let alone flourish. And so everything that we're doing is one massive storytelling project. I'm trying to make sense of the things that I sense in the world. And so I do that, but I have help from other people, first my parents and teachers and coaches and so forth. I'm trying to make sense of this. And one of those things I'm trying to make sense of is, what does it mean for me to be a human being and be in the world? What does it mean for me to, I'm trying to what am I doing here? And along comes the Christian story. And it tries to tell us who we are and the story that we're in and what are we doing here. And sometimes the way we tell the Christian story ends up being somewhat challenging, because somehow I end up hearing it or thinking about it in terms of the Christian story is I got to do all these things to become holy. I got to, to your point about your list, this is what it means for me to live in the Christian story. I got to do all this stuff. But the Christian story, we would suggest, doesn't begin with a list of things to do. The Christian story begins with begins with God's announcement that he has made us, as he said to the prophet Jeremiah, I knew you before I formed you. And I'm making you because I loved you first. I don't love you because I made you. I made you because I've loved you. And how many of us wake up in the morning and the first thing that we hear or sense or image or feel in the room is not the Holy Trinity in the room greeting us and saying, oh my gosh, we've been waiting for you all night. We can't wait to live Friday with you. We'd be like, who are you and what are you talking about? And who are you talking to? The degree to which God is passionately for us, with us, about us, longing to be in our minds and hearts and bodies and souls and in between us, it's lost to us. And in my brokenness and shame and so forth, I end up hearing the Christian story first and foremost as a list of things that I'm supposed to be doing. And that's not where it begins. And if I were so immersed in this holy Trinitarian relational dance that God is calling me to join because God is so passionately for our being in the world, I think I would find myself paying much less attention to a list of things that I have to do. Because if my attention is being drawn to someone who is just so delighted in me, once I actually got over, somehow came to terms with that, because it doesn't make sense to me that somebody would be this in love with me, that literally changes my neural structures. It changes the way my brain fires. And they also invite me to change the focus of my attention. And they'll ask me well, what do you want to become? Not just, have you done the list of things we've told you to do? What do you want to become? And if I'm immersed in a relationship in which I'm loved this deeply, I might find myself saying, well, I want to become like you. I think I want to be like what I'm experiencing. But then I go and try to do that, and I don't do that very well. And then they might say, yeah, we get that. This is the whole thing about why Jesus came, right? We get that you don't do what you want to do. So let's talk about how we can do that together. That process of being formed in that context of relationship, not formed as a function of the list of things I have to do, requires my willingness to submit to real relational interactions with other human beings. As I tell people, we don't have any relational reality with God that is not able to be demonstrated with real humans. People say, in our office, right? It's well, yes, I trust God, I just don't trust human beings. And I said, well, I think the reality is that we only trust God to the degree that we've actually been able to trust a real human being in some way, shape, or form here on earth, because our brains don't have any other category for what trust means. It's easy for me to say that I trust God until God actually shows up in the room and starts loving me in a way that feels overwhelming, that's way too intimate, where he starts to open windows and doors into the parts of my life that I'd like to not have him or anybody else see. Or when he starts to place demands on me, the kind of demands that invite me to actually love others in the way that I've been loved, but I can't give what I don't have. And so I'm going to have to practice being receptive to love in new ways. All of this is a far cry from just simply trying to behave and white knuckle it in this way, which also presumes that I'm going to have to do that by myself. I think the other thing that we're going to discover when we talk about these things at the conference is the beauty of the body of Christ, that Jesus didn't come to save each of us as 8 billion individuals. He came to save his people. And that we are on this journey together. And in being on that journey together, there are so many different ways for renewal to take place, and in which our brains are changed along the way.
So as you just described, knowing God in an embodied way, and our relationship to God is shaped by relationships to other embodied human beings. My mind goes, Christmas is next week. My mind goes to the Incarnation. Christianity has a God who takes a body and joins full humanness to himself.
Yes.
I mean, obviously that has massive implications for what we're talking about. Give us a sense of how the incarnation really drives this conversation.
Matt, we could probably talk for several days.
Maybe we need a second conference on that.
About this. And I think it's true. I think that, for me, so much about embodiment shows up in the first 4 chapters of Genesis, and then in the Gospels, and then is described in more beautiful language of theology by Paul, which of course he's not just making this stuff up. I'm assuming that he's had some kind of experience himself, both as a Jew and as a, first century dude. And, it's an experience. We like to say, look, theology doesn't just show up ex nihilo. We have an experience that gives us a sense of how we then write about our theology. And this notion that God shows up in an embodied fashion, I believe, changes everything. It changes absolutely everything. That my God would be willing to be stripped naked and beaten to a pulp and subjected to what is considered by many historians to be the worst that humans have ever done to other humans with the use of a crucifixion. My God is saying in no uncertain, real, material, unambiguous terms that there's no place that we are or have been as humans that he doesn't come to. That in that God coming for us, it's not make-believe. And there will be many of our listeners for whom, especially this past year, has felt like a year in which nobody's coming for them. And the news I would want them to hear is that God is coming for you. And part of our role as the church is to embody that for others. It changes everything.
I can't help but think, as you describe God's love for us in taking a body in Jesus and dying and suffering, like we can trust that God. A God who will do that for you is trustworthy.
Like no one else.
Curt, thanks for that word. Such a rich note. Good place to end. Friends, it's not the end of a conversation for us, though. It's the beginning. As I've already indicated, if you're watching this before February 2021, join us at the Hope Hole United Methodist Church Science and Faith Conference, the Science of Spiritual Formation. Dr. Curt Thompson will be with us in person and online. So if you're not in the Montgomery area, join us online. Curt, thanks for taking the time. Thanks for this. It's so clear that your faith is deep and rich, and that you are it drives your work, and that's really inspiring. Thank you.
Matt, thanks so much. It's great to be with you today, and I so much look forward to February.
We'll see you soon.
Very good.